rise above the static, dissecting issues diplomatic. With mics in hand, they brave the storm of clashing views and norms transform. The Pundits Podcast, bold and true, shining light on red and blue. Through heated takes and reasoned thought, they seek the truth that can't be bought. From climate change to foreign ties, they parse the spin and sift the lies. No stone unturned, no topic taboo, as left and right come into view. The Pundits Podcast, bold and true, shining light on red and blue. Through heated takes and reasoned thought, they seek the truth that can't be bought. From climate change to foreign ties, they parse the spin and sift the lies. No stone unturned, no topic taboo, as left and right come into view. The Pundits Podcast, bold and true, shining light on red and blue. Through heated takes and reasoned thought, they seek the truth that can't be bought. In times of strife when tensions flare, their steady voices fill the air. With wisdom gained from years gone by, and hopes for brighter days tonight, the Pundits Podcast marches on their epic quest, not yet done, to understand our changing world and keep democracy's flag unfurled.
Hey everybody, it's Razib with conversation number 7. We are recording the first week of September, so it's going to be heating up with the election and other things, but I don't think we're going to be talking directly about the election this week. We got some other stuff going on. We'll be talking about history, media, and social science, and give you a little preview, which I don't always do. But I'm here with my friend Josiah Neely of R Street, and today I think as we're recording, there's been an update, and I will update people on it. But this week, I think it was it 2 or 3 days ago, Tucker Carlson interviewed Darryl Cooper of the Martyr Made podcast, which is apparently the number 1 podcast on iTunes now, but it was massive before. I don't listen to him, but it's a very widely listened podcast, and he said some weird things. It was both Josiah and I actually listened to it, but he said a few weird things about how Churchill was the villain of World War II, and just some stuff about how people died, like millions died because the Germans weren't prepared for housing all those prisoners.
Notorious and lack of planning. That's what we think of at the Germans. They're just bad at logistics.
Yeah. I mean, and then but that started he said a lot of things on Twitter that are supposedly jokes. But
right.
I mean, if I was Jewish, I would be like, what's up with that? You know what I'm saying? I would be a little skeeved out, honestly, if I was Jewish, if someone's joking that, the Nazis that have better fashion sense than, drag queens.
Or Jerry Seinfeld has said that the Nazis had pretty good fashion sense. So that,
and they do. I mean, that's actually that's not wrong, as they say.
Right.
That's actually true. There's a lot of aesthetic things that we're not, we still use the Autobahn and there's other things, but it wasn't just that. There were other things. And
right.
Also, our old friend, I don't know if he mentioned Sohrab Ahmari, but, the Sohrab version 27, whatever. He was calling Darryl Cooper a Marcionite, which has traditionally been associated with anti-Semitism. And we actually had a discussion just on a group chat about whether he was a supersessionist. He's definitely a supersessionist, but he does sound like some of his tweet. I don't know if he is a Marcionite because that's more of a slur, but he does sound like a Marcionite in some of his tweets. And just to be clear, actually tell people what a Marcionite is, because it's just a weird thing to throw out there. But
yeah, I mean, I actually there were a number of his tweets that kind of sounded like that too. So Marcius, I think was his name, was a shipbuilder in, I don't know if it was the 2nd or 3rd century. It was early on.
Early second. I think he was born at the end of the first, died in the mid second, and he was from Sonobe originally.
Yeah.
He was rich.
He was a rich guy, yeah. And like, as sometimes happens with rich guys, you get into, theological or philosophical disputes. But anyway, his big thing on Christianity is he kind of originated the idea that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are two different beings, kind of, right? So the God of the Old Testament, and there is, people have noted this sometimes. I think that the distinction is kind of it's less clear than you might get popularly, but there is this idea, Old Testament God, is all about vengeance, smiting people, etc. And New Testament God is all about love and forgiveness and whatever. So his idea was, actually, like, those are two separate beings. The Old Testament God is basically evil. Christianity is not, like, it's fundamental rejection of Judaism and any sort of Jewish connection to Christianity. I think he threw out most of the Bible, except he liked the letters of Paul. He liked, I think it was the Gospel of
he must have
or whatever, but
he must have liked the Gospel of John.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But anyway, so it was basically just trying to draw like a hard line, not even so super sessionism, or however exactly you pronounce it, is something kind of different. This is the idea, in the Old Testament, the Jews had there was the old covenant with God, and then in the New Testament, you have the new covenant through Christ. And the question is, well, what happens to the old covenant? Is that still in effect or not? Basically, I think for most of Christian history, the standard view was the old covenant is over. It's been replaced, even though there are still Jews around. They're no longer practicing temple Judaism. It's like some other thing, and the real heirs of the Old Testament system is Christianity. It's not as popular these days. Some people might look askance on it even, although I still think it's true of like Eastern Orthodox theology, some Catholic and maybe some Protestant groups still believe in something like that. But that's not, Marcionism is like a step beyond that, I would say.
Yeah, Marcionism is considered a heresy. Right. So it's like a slur. I mean, I'm not saying, it's a technical thing, but it's used as a slur for someone that's clearly anti-Semitic and like basically cutting the Jewish roots of Christianity out of the religion. I will say one thing about Marcionism and the God of the Old and the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. If you read the Bible all the way through in a sequential way, it's not as shocking, but most people don't. And like, if you're just like, I don't know, reading a little bit of Genesis or something in Leviticus, and then you jump to the Gospel of John or something like that, you'd be like, whoa.
Right.
And so that's one thing that I've always thought is that, and also like the order of the books has not always necessarily been, it hasn't always been distributed like that. So, I don't know how the early, you know what I'm saying? Like if you got like books in a weird order, you'd be like, this is kind of like jarring. Like the character arc, of the God is going to be a little weird. And I honestly would like understand why people would be like a little like, wait a second, like this is not the same person. But because like people say that the old version of the New Testament God, but there is stuff in the Old Testament where God's not that mean, like there's already a germ of that. Yeah.
There's a lot. Jesus talks a lot in the New Testament about like hell and,
there's the book of Revelation,
right?
And I come to bring the sword. So it's like, it's a little bit more jumbled than people think, but okay, let's get off like biblical criticism because that's not the primary thing. But this morning,
let's talk about
controversial,
Hitler,
like Nazis. Yeah. But so this morning, J.D. Vance refused to denounce Tucker Carlson or denounce. Wait, what is it? J.D. Vance. This is a declines to denounce Carlson after interview with Holocaust revisionism. And I want to quote this one part because I really like this part. This is what I like about J.D. Vance, but I probably know where it comes from. The Vance campaign spokesman wrote, Senator Vance doesn't believe in guilt by association cancel culture, but he obviously does not share the views of the guest interviewed by Tucker Carlson. I like that because that's kind of what's been like a really big deal the last 5 years or like 7 years. That the media has really pushed guilt by association cancel culture. So it's like you talk to so-and-so who talked to so-and-so who talked to so-and-so who's married to so-and-so. Like,
Right.
do you denounce this person you've never heard of before?
Right.
And people will just be like, yeah, I denounce them, and then like, people are like, they're not really a Nazi or something. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
right.
The whole thing is just, it's a really bad trend. I do like the fact that J.D. Vance was basically like, look, I'm going on Carlson's, I'm going to be talking to Tucker. I don't know about this other stuff.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair. I agree with you. I don't like this trend. I saw someone on Twitter. I won't say who it is. On X, I won't say who it is. But, Victor Davis Hanson, right? The academic conservative writer, he wrote a piece in response to this Darryl Cooper interview on Tucker, offering rebuttal criticism of the claims, etc. And someone on X was like, oh, well, how can you, now you're against him, but you've been on Tucker. So, how can you be against this guy who is also on Tucker? Like, just think about what you're saying, guys. Like, this sort of worldview only makes sense if you expect, you can only talk to people if they agree with you, right? That's the only way this sort of transitivity makes sense. And if that's alien to my mindset, all right? I think that, in fact, I will go say it's more than alien. That's a bad mindset, That's a bad mindset if you want to understand the world, if you want to understand people, to have that view, right? Tucker, you can have like criticisms of Tucker, you can have criticisms of the guest or whatever, but when you start to get into the it is guilt by association, not just guilt by association, but like guilt by 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, they're going to ask Kevin Bacon, do you denounce, whoever, because you were in this movie with this guy who was in a movie with Mel Gibson, and Mel Gibson, as we know, made these statements, right, of, about the Jews or whatever. Like, I don't think that's, it's not healthy for society, but more fundamentally, it's just dumb.
It's dumb. It's not healthy. It's also selective. Because like on the left, like the media is not going to go after someone. Well, so and so hung out with so and so, who hung out with so and so, who hung out with Bob Seger, who's a communist or something. You could do that easily. You could do that with anybody, actually. With that sort of. So I don't, and that's actually one of the. So I actually, I didn't say too much because I wanted to save my takes for the conversation. But I did say, so Elon retweeted and said, "This is interesting," of Tucker's interview of Darryl Cooper. Right. Well, I kind of defended Elon because I was like, I'm pretty sure he didn't listen to the whole thing because most of it was pretty boring. Right. And I'm pretty sure he didn't know anything about the guy's weird tweets. And, and so it's one of those things where it's like, he probably heard some of it. He's like, oh, well, Tucker's cool. This stuff sounded interesting. And so, I'm going to retweet it. All I know about the guy, I know a little bit, is it's a very big podcast, first of all. The fact that we don't listen to it, it's not as big as Rogan, but it's really big. Okay. Yeah. So Tucker's,
I've tried, I gotta say, I've never, I'm not hugely familiar with Darryl Cooper, but I am familiar with somewhat. I've tried to listen to his podcast. It was on topics where, I should have found it interesting. I found it off-putting. I couldn't do it. I've never liked the guy. He does these kind of, they're history-themed podcasts, and they're like deep dives. So they're like 20 hours, 30 hours he did one on the People's Temple, Jim Jones, Jonestown. That's a very interesting topic to me, He did another one about Israel-Palestine, the origins of Israel, another interesting topic. I like so, and a lot of people have even not just like crazy right wingers, but like Jesse Singal, Norm Dorman, I think is his name, who runs the Comedy Cellar. Other people have said, "Oh yeah, this stuff is really good and really interesting." Regardless of these other views. So he's, they like it. Personally, is something about the style that I just don't like. It's very discursive, and he takes forever to get to a point. And there's a lot of like, this is just kind of like an attitude of where he's trying to like hype it up. Like, these are the most, like no one will tell you this, this exciting, stuff. Can you believe, whatever. I don't. So I personally find that a little grating, but a lot of people like it. And I could see Elon or whoever, it's a 2.5 hour like when he did with the interview with Tucker, that was also a 2.5 hour podcast. And they start out talking about Jim Jones, and I think it's half an hour or something before they get to the World War II stuff. So I could see someone definitely listen to part of it and be like, oh, well, yeah, that's interesting. And, not even getting to the other stuff. Right.
Yeah. So I listened to, okay. So I think the presentation style, I think the reason it's not optimal for me either. And I'll say the reason is, I know you listen to audiobooks. When you listen to audiobooks, those are originally written as books.
Yeah.
And so when they read it as an audiobook, it's a book that's read out loud. Darryl Cooper's podcasts are not like books that are read out loud. They are clearly meant to be, I know he's reading off a script, but they're clearly meant to be audio and kind of narrated in this dramatic fashion to an audio audience. And so, you say, so I listened to a couple of them, but the Anti-Humans I listened to.
I tried the Anti-Human. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was just like, a lot of it was just like, okay, like, you don't need to spend this much time on this. We get it. In a book, it would be like, okay, like, what's going on? Like, where's the editor?
Right.
He does not have, and a lot of his audience might not know. Also, when I listen to the Anti-Humans, also when I like listen to like the Tucker stuff, I'm not a big World War II person. I haven't read that much on it, but like I'm just like, wait a second, like why? Like, okay, like yes, it was bad. He said 30 to 40,000 Germans were killed in Eastern Europe, and like I'm just like, okay, but like the context here is like, should you tell the listeners what happened in the general like in that like region of Poland to the Poles and the Jews before that, and like who was involved? I'm just saying like, it's like this amazing thing that he's telling people, and I'm like, wait, you're leaving some context out, bro. Anyway, I'm just
and this is, I think, also, and if the two, kind of two main criticisms of specifically the Tucker interview that he said two things. I mean, he said a lot of things that I think could be criticized, but there are two things that I think got most of the blowback. One, very much deserved. One, I think is partially misunderstood. The first thing, which we can come back to, is he said that Churchill was the greatest villain of World War II, right? Like the chief villain, right? The chief villain of World War II. Okay. That's pretty dumb. We can come back to that. But then he has, and this is, I think, a problem with Cooper. It's something that affects all of us, but him particularly. His mind is very discursive. It seems to kind of jump around a lot. So, for example, he said this thing about Churchill. Churchill's the chief villain of World War II. Tucker says, okay, that's a bold claim. Can you justify that? And almost immediately he starts talking about Hitler invading Russia Hitler invaded Russia, he says, and they got so many POWs, they didn't know what to do with them, and they were starving. And someone wrote a letter saying maybe it would be more humane if we just killed them, right? So that, like, he later on X, I think he kind of explained the missing chunks of that in his mind that makes it make a little bit more sense, right? But a lot of people took him saying that, and they thought he was talking about the Holocaust, right? Like he's talking about people in camps in Eastern Europe, starving to death, and the Germans thinking maybe it would be better to kill them or whatever, right? And so
Yeah.
I think it's understandable. So he was not talking about that, I don't think. I mean, he does. There are a couple references in there where he says
What?
like local political prisoners or people that were rounded up.
Yeah.
100% clear, but it does seem like he is talking about specifically the Russian soldiers that were captured during Operation Barbarossa, and a lot of them starved to death. And his claim, which is also not true, is that this was just a logistical problem. The Germans didn't know what to do with all these people. Actually, Hitler was very explicit before Barbarossa. It's like, no, we don't need a plan for taking care of prisoners because we're just going to kill them all, right? We just let them starve, right? So that's wrong.
Russia was for Lebensraum, right?
Correct. Yeah. The plan was we got to kill the people anyway, so it's to save us time. But that is like millions of people died like millions of POWs died in those camps. Part of that also, I mean, it was not just Germany. I do think you have to say like the Germans treated POWs on the Eastern Front much worse than they did like Western Front POWs. And part of that was because Stalin treated the German POWs very badly. And Stalin did have this attitude that if you were taken alive, if you're a Russian soldier and you get taken alive, you're kind of like a traitor.
A loser. A loser.
Right. Yeah. So they didn't do much to like help out.
Stalin liked winners.
Yeah, like Red Cross or other stuff like that. So, okay. But nevertheless, a lot of people died. That's not that's distinct from the Holocaust, right? People, I think, were confusing those two things. However, I can only partially it is kind of weird. Part of the reason why they made that confusion is, despite it being a 2.5-hour podcast, they spent a lot of time on World War II. It's not all on World War II, but they never discuss the Holocaust. It never gets brought up. The only time it gets alluded to, strangely, is when they're talking about how you can be put in jail in Europe for looking into the wrong corners of the official history, right? In Austria, which seems like that's a reference to David Irving, who is a Holocaust denier who went to jail in Austria. Personally, I do not approve of those laws. I don't think it should be illegal to deny the Holocaust, but that's not because I think that it's an interesting, I don't think it's because if you were to look into it, you would find out that the Holocaust didn't happen or whatever. So they don't talk about it. Maybe that, I mean, the charitable interpretation is they're talking about revisionist views on World War II. Maybe Darryl Cooper, his views on the Holocaust are just completely standard. Everybody already knows about it, so you don't need to mention it. I think it probably would have helped him if he had mentioned it, even to just distinguish, being like, hey, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about specifically the POWs. But yeah, so that's kind of weird.
Well, it's it's weird that the editor wasn't like, hey, this kind of listens a little strangely if you just jump into it without any context.
Yeah.
It's like World War II, death, POW, camps,
right?
Holocaust. I will say, people online, because some of it is I think whatever, the podcast's okay. I mean, I listened to it. It's not our taste, but
Right.
People were saying and so the really big reaction was in conservative Twitter, and he's this guy. Some people have known of him, and so basically, I'm going to call them hit pieces. I think they were pretty good actually, but the Free Press, Barry Weiss's editor-in-chief, Barry Weiss's publication, published Sharma Marty on the Barbarian Right, which was a bit of a hit, and then Victor Davis Hanson. I read both of them. I have to say, like I said, I don't feel like I'm a big World War II person, but as I read Hanson's thing, I nodded along because I was like, okay, this is what I've read, this is what I've heard. So it was just okay, I don't know, like what is new in what Cooper is saying? Like, I don't know, but and like I think one of it is like some of the stuff he's read is revisionist, which you've read some of the stuff and you said that wasn't great. I want to say, so what people on the right, like mostly like kind of like neoconservative, more neoconservative types. I'm gonna put it that way, more mainstream conservative, like National Review types. We're basically saying he is a Holocaust denier.
Right.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
I didn't see any smoking gun that he was like a Holocaust denier. But so that's frustrating because like I don't know this guy. I'm trying to figure stuff out. You calling him a Holocaust denier? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would not say in that there's nothing in that interview where that I would consider Holocaust denial. I mean, they don't even talk about it, right? So you can't really deny it if you don't talk about it. People also called him a Nazi apologist, which I also don't think is quite fair. As you mentioned, it turns out, and I hadn't really thought about it this way, but in the subsequent discussion, I've actually read a lot of revisionist historical literature about World War II. Like people were talking about all these books, and I've read Human Smoke, which is a book that basically takes a pacifist position that World War II could have been avoided, and that like the Allies kind of like provoked Hitler into it. I've read Stalin's War, which is kind of highlights Stalin's role and argues that he was kind of a prime mover in it. I've read The Phony Victory by Peter Hitchens, which is kind of more about, it's about like the strategic bombing and basically how Britain got screwed over by the United States in the war. I read Victims of Yalta, all sorts of stuff, right? So there is, I would say, I would say there's a lot of areas in World War II revisionism where it's debatable. You can have like reasonable pro and cons, what was the like role of Stalin? What like the moves that were made up to World War II, what could have been done differently during the war. So I'm actually, I'm pretty open to all that. I'm not. I don't think history should be viewed as like a comic book story, right? I do think like Hitler, I do think was bad. I'm glad he lost. But certainly there were a lot of things that the Allies did that I think were bad or strategically inept. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to do those arguments. But Cooper's, at least his presentation of it, was so pathetic, right? Like, I think it's hard. Let's take the Churchill thing. Okay, so this is the other big thing that he got in trouble for, is he said Churchill was the chief villain of World War II. Now, aside from anything else, Churchill was not prime minister of the United Kingdom until May of 1940, right? So all the stuff in the lead up to the war, during the first months of the war, Hitler invading Poland, invading Denmark, invading Norway, invading Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, France. Churchill, you can't really blame him for that, I don't think. He was not even in the government, prior to the outbreak of the war. Then he does become prime minister in May of 1940, but starting in the summer of 1941, Hitler invades Germany. Then you have Pearl Harbor. As was alluded to, most of the carnage and death and damage in the war happens in the East, right? It happens in Eastern Europe. It happens on the Russian front. It happens in the Pacific. Once Russia enters the war, once the United States enters the war, Churchill he's no longer one of the two main protagonists, right? He's a secondary figure. He's not unimportant, but I really don't see how you can blame him or hold him chiefly responsible for any of that, right? So there's only a 1-year period from May of 1940 to June of 1941 where you can say he's even in the game as a contender, right? What can you say about this? the chief thing that I think people point to is, and it is true, after France was defeated, Dunkirk, Britain is in a kind of tough spot, right? Like Germany has kind of run the tables. It's not clear what the way forward is, and Germany did put out peace feelers, both directly and then indirectly through Italy, saying, "Hey, look, guys, we would like to be friends. We'll make you a deal. We get to be in control of Europe. You can keep your empire. We'll be friends, blah, 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 blah." Okay. And in the British cabinet, there were discussions. Should we pursue this? Should we not? Lord Halifax, who was a conservative, bigwig in the Conservative Party, he wanted to pursue it. Churchill said no. Churchill kind of won out, and they didn't pursue it. Right. It's questionable whether, so the argument would be, okay, look, they should have just cut their losses, ended the war there. Maybe if there had been no war, then all the other bad stuff that it happened later on the war wouldn't have happened, right? Problems.
Yeah.
Here's the issue.
Well, I mean,
okay,
go on.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I will say is I feel like, and like I said, I don't know that much about World War II. I feel like a lot of these sorts of arguments about Churchill and the British and their agency presupposes a particular view about Hitler's aims.
Right.
That's where they're kind of, we have modest aims at just, continental European domination. They're like,
yeah,
we're gonna stop there.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's so you do have to think about not only what was true, but also what was reasonable or could have been known by the actors at the time, right? So I do think, and this is not a Churchill point, but a big issue in general with talking about should the British have considered peace terms, other things, is that Hitler had shown himself repeatedly to be untrustworthy in this regard, right? So during the Munich crisis, when Chamberlain meets with Hitler and Mussolini and everybody at Munich, Hitler says, "Look, if you just give me these areas, these German areas in Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, that's all I want, right? I don't want the rest of Czechoslovakia. This is my last claim," or whatever. And Chamberlain says, "Okay," they agree. And then in March of a few months later, in 1939, Hitler just occupies the rest of Czechoslovakia, right? And the conclusion of Chamberlain and a lot of other people in the British government is, okay, if Hitler says, "Look, this is all I want, I'm not going to do anything else," he's lying, right? Like, you can't trust him. That's why they made the guarantee to Poland, right? That's why they were not, So later on, when Hitler says, "Hey, I want peace," is it a credible, even if, and I do think if you read like Mein Kampf or whatever, Hitler did view the British as like natural long-term allies in a way that wasn't true of France or Russia, right? So maybe he was telling the truth, but it's not credible, right? It's not credible. It also would have gone against what had been British foreign policy for 500 years, which is British foreign policy since the 1500s was all about divided Europe, right? You don't want a single power controlling the continent, whether it's Napoleon, whether it's Kaiser Wilhelm or whatever. You have to break that up because that's going to be an existential threat to you in the long term. So accepting that would have required just going against that. Maybe they could have done it anyway, but let's say that they did, right? Let's say that, Halifax had won out and they say, "Okay, we're just going to end the war. We'll be, we'll chill out. We'll have India and everything. We can focus on that." As was mentioned, like most of the carnage and bad stuff happens because Hitler invades Russia, right? In 1941. If he ends the war with Britain, that does not prevent him from invading Russia. In fact, it makes it easier for him to invade Russia, right? All that stuff still happens, maybe on an updated, maybe on a later timetable. So it just boggles my mind as to how you could hold Churchill or Britain responsible for any of that.
And I feel if he invaded Russia, we're doing all counterfactual here. If he invaded Russia, then Britain, Britain is not going to let Germany become a big power in Central Asia. Then the Great Game kicks off. So I think basically you're just going to have an Anglo, realignment with Russia just on a different schedule. Like the details will be different, but it's almost like we're describing here a geopolitical inevitability given that Hitler wanted to repopulate Russia with Germans.
Right. Yeah. This it's kind of like, that's a big part of both his view and Nazi ideology with Rosenberg or whatever was the need. Okay, we need breathing space. We need all this land. We're going to populate it with Germans. The people there we can get rid of. I don't like, that's not something that Churchill put into Hitler's mind. And that's all of this is just talking about Europe, right? Churchill did not make the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, right? Churchill did not. Here's an interesting, just as a side note, people usually date the outbreak of World War II is September 1st, 1939, because that's when Hitler invades Poland. Occasionally people talk about, December 7th, 1941, because we're Americans, so we think about when we entered the war or whatever. I've always thought it was weird that we don't date World War II from the invasion of China by Japan. Maybe it's because we just don't think, we're Eurocentric or whatever, but there's kind of there's two halves to the war, and they don't totally connect. The Soviet Union is not fighting Japan until the very end of the war. The two fronts are not really connected. Japan and Germany are allies, but they aren't sending each other troops or whatever. But that aspect, if you think about it, that's part of, like, Japan, clearly part of World War II. The invasion of China clearly has something to do with it. Anyway, that's just an aside. But all of that stuff also you really can't blame on Churchill or the British or whatever. So it's just not there are, I think, reasonable or defensible revisionist arguments that you can make about a lot of this stuff. Same thing on the Japanese side, right? Like, did we have to, did we in some way provoke the Japanese, or did FDR know about Pearl Harbor ahead of time? It's a lot of, there's a spectrum of, I would say, like, more reasonable to more fringy stuff. But even a lot of the more fringy stuff, in my opinion, is better sourced than what Cooper was saying in this podcast, right? Now, maybe, it's a podcast, right? It's not.
Yeah, it's a podcast.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to the reaction, though. So obviously, it's not a Holocaust denier, whatever, but there was really, really strong reaction, and I think this is like online right mostly. I think the left were enjoying it. But basically they're like, because like there is a Churchill cult.
Yes.
And I think it annoys a lot of people because it's like, look, this was just a person. It's like people need a perfect exemplar of whatever, Gandhi, Churchill. And then there are other people who are like, well, actually Churchill said this or did this or Gandhi said this. And, this is like the back and forth that happens. And I feel like that's one of the dynamics that is being exposed here, where a lot of people privately are just kind of like, just shut up about Churchill. He died a long time ago,
Right. Well, and, a lot of people, I would say, only care about history or primarily care about history to the extent it's usable in some modern political argument, right? So one of the things that I think does motivate some, particularly on the more paleoconservative side of things, about Churchill and World War II and all that stuff, is they view it as being used now to promote the Iraq War or stuff they don't like in Ukraine or other, hawkish military policy is, this is held up that, okay, we've got to invade, Haiti because remember Munich, we didn't do anything at Munich and then there was a world war and a Holocaust, right? So I do think this seems to be, and to the extent, I mean, I can't read anybody's mind, but this seems to be more where Tucker was coming from in a lot of this, right? If you just his reaction comments or whatever, it seems like he's trying to tie it back to, the media today is telling me that we have to do, X, Y, and Z. And in the background of justifying that is all this World War II stuff. So if you can, put a tarnish on that a little bit, then that will undercut the current efforts to do this stuff that I don't like. Right. And on the flip side, I do think, that to some extent, people want to maintain Churchill and World War II as a kind of comic book story because it's politically useful in that way, right? That's not the only reason, there's a coolness factor, right? But people like the idea of, the underdog, hopeless circumstances, but you refuse to give up and you come back and you win and all this stuff. And, 1,000 years of British history, all that. I mean, that's all fine and understandable. But I think that partially explains why people care on both sides, right? It's the same thing, it's the same thing with Lincoln. Lincoln's another figure where, a lot of conservatives view him as a hero. You can find paleo conservatives a lot. There's an element of actually he was the chief villain of the Civil War, right? And some of that has to do with just historical things, but a lot of it has to do with modern politics. They don't like Lincoln because they view him as a precursor of a overreaching federal government or whatever it is. So I think that's partly what's going on, at least in the case of Tucker, at least in the case of some other people. And history is important to people, right? Even in Americans in general, we don't care about history the way other countries do. Other countries really care about history, especially if you go Russia. The Russians, they really care about history. The Serbs really care about history. The Greeks, they really care about history. Americans mostly don't, right? We care about maybe two or three things, and one of them.
Yeah, and we don't have that much history, right?
Yeah, that's part of it.
The Greeks have 2,500 and we have 250.
Right.
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it's a big contrast. I want to say something just about so this is related to something that I always hear about Lincoln. It's Lincoln has a quote where he would free the slaves to save the Union.
Right.
He would keep the slaves to save the Union, all this stuff. And it's kind of to show, well, actually, he wasn't such a good guy and all he cared about was the Union. People can have disagreements about it. My personal view is yes, by modern standards, he's obviously would be counted as racist. But actually, I feel for some of his period as a public politician later on, I think he was underplaying how much he really disliked slavery. And because it would make him seem like an abolitionist or a radical. So it's one of those things, you see that quote, and you're like, oh, he didn't care about slavery at all. But I actually think he did care about slavery a lot. But as a politician, he's going to say a lot of different things. And he's going to, and also to get elected, he's got to seem, frankly, pretty white supremacist.
Yes. And I mean, I do think it's a little bit anachronistic. I do think he had views that today would probably be considered racist. Yes. And I also think, he clearly was anti-slavery. It was a big part of the motivation for his re-entry into politics and, all of that. But people, but at the same time, I don't know that was his utmost priority. You could say that you can care about something a lot and still not think that it is the overriding concern in all cases, right? So in the case of the Union, or even in the case, when he was running, his view was no expansion of slavery, right? Don't want to, where slavery is now, if the states that have it, we're not going to touch it there, not because we don't think it's wrong there, but because for the same reason that a person, like North Korea is basically a slave state, right? Should we invade North Korea to get rid of slavery? No, that would not make sense, right? Because the costs involved in doing that are just too high. Doesn't mean you approve of the North Korean system. Actually, it's very bad. But you're not going to, you're not going to launch a war in order to stop that, right? So
Yeah.
that I think was kind of.
You don't want the president of the United States, when he is talking to Kim Jong Un, to be like, "You're a slave state." Just like that's not like productive.
Right. So
it's true, but
yes,
that's not either there. So I'm bringing that up because you can bring some facts into the foreground for a lot of people, and they're like amazed because like there's context to these things, and you got to like. So okay, I don't know how to say this because people don't usually say things like this. I actually think that I'm not sure. So I think Darryl Cooper reads a lot of books.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if his processor is up to sifting it well, if that makes sense. Right? Because because I've listened to him, he gets deeply into things, and like I said, I've listened to some of his podcasts and I've been like, wait, this is essential context for the novice. Why are you not giving the essential context?
Right.
It's like he forgets to yeah, anyway, go on.
I mean, he has the kind of air of the autodidact, right? Self-taught. Also some of it, and this is maybe this is a little unfair. This is a little extreme, but some of it reminds me of, a year or two ago, there was this thing where women on TikTok were reading Osama bin Laden's letter to America, and they're like, wow, I can't believe, I was told that he was this horrible guy, but I'm reading this letter and he's actually saying that he's, he had to do the attacks because, of American imperialism and, X, Y, and Z. And it actually sounds reasonable. And some of that, there's a kind of, naivete, almost like a childlike feeling, like you've never been some of this I think could be just if you've never been exposed to a more sophisticated or nuanced view of things.
Yeah. Well, if you're not polished, people, I mean, this is not necessarily a negative thing.
Right.
People, there were conservatives when Glenn Beck was really big about 15 years ago and he was getting into the founding fathers. And I mean, some of Glenn Beck's amazement and some of his pronouncements were frankly almost childlike, as if he had never read any of this. Yes. But he didn't go to college. He started working in high school. So part of it was Glenn Beck was a 40-something-year-old man for the first time getting deeply into revolutionary American history and early American, political philosophical thought. And so he did strike people as, just a little naive, a little unpolished, because it was true.
Yeah. He's got the same autodidact, flavor or style to him or whatever. So,
and I think they're both extremely popular. I think if you can combine that with a particular presentation style, it's extremely wide breadth of popularity of interest of this sort of history. It's not our cup of tea, but it is actually what quote the people want, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. And it's not necessarily all bad. It's good. I think it's good to get people interested in this stuff or whatever. But hopefully at most it would be a stay. The criticism that you shouldn't make Churchill into a comic book hero is undermined when instead you try to make him into a comic book villain, right? You're not really the goal is to move beyond to a beyond that to a higher
Move beyond the
standard.
comic book.
Like-
Move beyond the comic book. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, as we're closing out on this topic, and we should go on the Russian stuff. I will say is my basic attitude after this week, because like I don't know, maybe there's going to be a picture that comes out where he is dressed like as a Waffen SS, like he's cosplaying as a Waffen SS guy. You know what I'm saying? Like it could all be true. He could be a Nazi. I don't think so. I think like the criticisms of his lack of historiography, are warranted. I think that sort of stuff is warranted. I think people should like chill out a little bit on he's an anti-Semite Nazi, because you don't really know deep in his heart. He might have been he's obviously edgy. He's obviously never someone who's going to be I don't know, a historian on PBS. Okay.
Right.
But he has a massive podcast. A lot of mainstream people listen to him. Jesse Singal, Sagar and Jenny, Leighton Wethouse, like non-right-wing people listen to him. He has an engaging style, and most of the content is not whatever his personal views. The content is not that controversial. Sometimes it can be overly simplistic, in my opinion. But everything that I've listened to is like, okay, it's not really controversial. Like he doesn't, whatever he tweets, his tweets are actually quite different than his podcast. So, or maybe I haven't read his Substack, because he has a Substack too.
I haven't, and I can't claim to be comprehensive even on his tweets. It is hard to tell, particularly on social media, what people mean, what sort of level of irony or provocation or whatever versus someone's sincere views. So it's hard to tell. And frankly, I don't care enough about the guy to really give it a lot of thought.
Yeah.
What's really in his head.
Yeah.
So so that's not the part that really interests me. There's various things where you could say, well, is he being stupid, or is he like actually craftily, doing something malicious? And I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and say, well, maybe it's just stupidity in this particular case or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so the last thing we'll say, and then let's do a paywall, is I will say, the whole JD Vance, cancellation by association and all these things, just to tie it back into that, I find it kind of hilarious and annoying. And I think this is done more on the left than the right, because the left has been able to do this until recently, where it's like, Tucker shouldn't have platformed him. He platformed and made this guy into a huge thing. And I'm just like, a lot of the times that they say this, the person is already a huge thing.
Yeah.
Like Martyr Made is arguably in the same range as Tucker already. He was already he's probably the biggest history podcast already. So, it's not like Tucker is taking an obscure person. He's obscure to us, but to like the average person, he's actually pretty well known. And so I think people need to just like think about like this whole like platforming, blah, blah, blah. It's like, hey, a lot of the mainstream media has much smaller platforms than a lot of the podcasters now.
That's true.
Put that up.
There's also, and this is a hard problem to do anything about if it's even a problem, but he obviously got a lot of attention and new subscribers from this interview. However, how much of that was from the interview itself versus the reaction to it, right? If people had not freaked out and started calling him names, like you bring a lot more attention to it, obviously that's going to drive subscriptions as well. So if you really hate the guy and you don't want, in a way, ironically, the criticism is itself a platforming of this guy, right? Because you are bringing more attention to him, which you say you don't like, and it is helping him financially, which you say you don't.
I want to say that, and then I don't, because then I'm doing the same thing. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
I want to quote tweet and be like, "What are you doing here?"
Yeah, this is how I feel. And apologies, I don't, and the analogy is very strict and precise here, but Richard Hanania, he does a lot of, he posts a lot of stuff on X, and people will argue with him, or they'll come into like group chats and be like, "Have you seen this horrible thing that Hanania says. And my general view is, hey, look, Hanania gets money from engagements on X, right? This is clearly, in my opinion, a major reason why he is doing all this like why he's like trolling or being provocative or whatever, is to try and get engagement. So if you want to give him money, then that's fine. Go ahead and engage and spread it in group chats or whatever. But if you don't like the guy, right, you don't want to support him, why are you coming and showing this to other people and spreading it around, right? Don't you like, that's kind of the attitude that I take there. And so I would say the same thing with regard to this Smarter Made Darryl Cooper thing. If you really don't want to give him money, then just ignore him, right? If you don't care,
it would be like,
you don't care, then okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be like, you're hanging out with your bros, and okay, this is a weird analogy. I just like thought of it, but I'm trying to think of like something that it feels similar to me. It's like your friend comes up and he's just like, and this is like maybe like 30 years ago to make more sense. He's like, did you see that they're like selling gay porn videos in the main? And like, you're like, okay, like that's gross. And he's like, yeah, look at this, I bought it. Like, look at this. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's like, I agree with you. It's just like, okay, what's happening here? Usually what I do is just like, I just like close the window and I come back like because it'll burn itself out.
Right.
And then like, because 3 hours into it, everybody will be like, wait, isn't he just winning?
Right.
Like he's just winning by us talking, that they'll realize. But all right. Speaking of winning or like winning a windfall, we're gonna talk about the Russia media interference, which is probably real this time. All right. So the context is a couple of days ago, there was an indictment that was posted. It was an indictment that was posted, right?
Right.
And basically the situation is, hope you enjoyed the podcast so far. To listen to the rest of it, please go to conversation.substack.com.
Two minds met on a summer's eve, each with truths they long believed. Words flowed like a winding stream as hours passed in deep debate. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. It's not about who's wrong or right, but understanding others' light. In civil discourse we can find ties that gently bind. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. dewy grass. They smiled and shook hands at last. Two souls enriched by reason talk, united in respect. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. This folk song captures the essence of a long, thoughtful discussion between two public intellectuals. It emphasizes the power of patient listening, mutual respect, and the discovery of common ground. The gentle tone reflects the common understanding they reach after their debate. Would you like me to expand on any aspect